What I have here is a copy of Donald Trump's tax returns. We have his federal tax return for 1 year, for 2005. I believe this is the only set of the president's federal taxes that reporters have ever gotten a hold of. What we have are these 2 pages, front and back, from the same 1040 form that you might have filled out when you file your taxes. And in terms of what's on here, let me give you the basics. Aside from the numbers being large, these pages are straightforward. He paid $38 million, looks like $38 million in taxes. He took a big write-down of $103 million. More on that later. If you add up the lines for income, he made more than $150 million in that year. Mazel tov. We got these pages. We got this document today from a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist who's better on financial matters than almost anybody else in the business. His name is David K. Johnston. These pages turned up the other day in his mailbox. David will join us live here in just a moment. But because nobody has had the president's taxes before, we didn't know what to expect. When we showed this 2005 return to the White House to ask them if it's real, we sent this over to the White House tonight, and the White House responded basically with, yep. I'm going to read you the White House statement on this tonight. Quote, "Before being elected president, Mr. Trump was one of the most successful businessmen in the world, with a responsibility to his company, his family, and his employees to pay no more tax than legally required. That being said, Mr. Trump paid $38 million, even after taking into account large-scale depreciation for construction on an income of more than $150 million, as well as paying tens of millions of dollars in other taxes, such as sales and excise taxes and employment taxes. And this illegally published return proves just that. Despite this substantial income figure and tax paid, it is totally illegal to steal and publish tax returns. The dishonest media can continue to make this part of their agenda, while the president will focus on his, which includes tax reform that will benefit all Americans." White House statement for tonight. For the record, the First Amendment gives us the right to publish this return. It is not illegally published, nor are we fake. Pinch me, I'm real. But good on the White House for acknowledging the return as proof of what the president made and paid that year. Here's the thing, though. A full tax return for someone like Donald Trump would be a lot longer than the 2 pages that we have here. There are all kinds of schedules and notes and attachments that could be involved, all containing information about the president and his money. Why will he not release his taxes, his full taxes, the way other presidents have done? Why not let the public see the information for themselves? We have obtained this, but this is all we've got. This tells us something. But he still has disclosed, apparently willingly disclosed, nothing compared to all other modern presidents. Joining us now is David K. Johnston. He's editor and founder of DCReport.org, which has posted this document as of a few minutes ago. He's also the author of The Making of Donald Trump and the Pulitzer Prize-winning financial reporter who found the president's 2005 tax returns in his mailbox. David, thank you for being here.
Delighted.
First of all, congratulations on this scoop. What can you tell us about how you got these pages, how you got this document?
Came in the mail over the transom, and there is absolutely nothing improper about journalists, if you haven't solicited something, getting it over the transom. And by the way, let me point out, it's entirely possible that Donald sent this to me. Donald Trump has, over the years, leaked all sorts of things. The very sleazy girl-on-girl pictures of the First Lady in the New York Post may have come from Donald. The front pages of the state tax returns that we had that were sent to the New York Times and the New York Daily News last fall may have come from Donald. Donald has a long history of leaking material about himself when he thinks it's in his interests.
Do we have reason to believe that those documents that you just described there were leaked by him, or is it just a possibility?
It's a possibility, and it could have been leaked by someone in his direction. But with Donald, you know, you never know. Donald creates his own reality, and he says things that aren't true. He says things and then denies he said them. He lives in this world that isn't the world of where you and I live, of verifiable facts. So, yes, I think I have to include that in the list of possibilities of where it came from.
When you look at this document, when you look at these numbers, obviously we don't have the supporting schedules and the sort of appendices that you get in big tax returns. Do these numbers seem right to you? Obviously, the White House statement to us is reiterating the $150 million income number and the $38 million paid number. Those numbers seem right to you?
Yes, and they fit the things we know from other public records about how Donald does business. For example, the dividends that he gets are primarily not what are called qualified dividends. That suggests they come from not big companies like ExxonMobil, but privately held enterprises. They show almost no tax-exempt interest, about $49,000. That would imply at the time maybe $900,000 of municipal bonds. Not much. I mean, there are lots of college professors out there my age who have $900,000 in municipal bonds. What's most important about this tax return, though, Rachel, is that under the regular tax system, remember we have two tax systems. Well-to-do people, you and I, effectively calculate our tax twice, the regular tax system and the alternative minimum tax. If we didn't have the alternative minimum tax, and Donald Trump, in writing, wants to end the alternative minimum tax, he would have paid taxes at a lower rate than the bottom half of taxpayers, the poor in this country who make less than $33,000. Now think about that. On $153 million, almost of income, he would have paid a little over $5 million, less than 3.5%, less than the half of taxpayers who make under $33,000. As it is, because of the alternative minimum tax, he paid $36.5 million, not the $38 the White House statement says. They're counting his self-employment tax, which is payroll taxes. $36.5 million, he paid 24%. You know who pays 24% in this country? Married couples with two incomes like my wife and I who make about $400,000 a year. Donald Trump and his wife that year made $418,000 a day. And the point of this is the top in this country, people at the top, are not burdened the way we suggest. I was in
let me stop you and let me restate some of that back to you, because
Sure.
you're a tax expert, and those of us who just pay taxes and aren't experts in them, I want to say it back to you and you tell me if I'm getting it right. If there weren't something called the alternative minimum tax, you can tell from this 1040, from these 2 pages from his tax return in 2005, if there weren't an alternative minimum tax, he'd be paying what percent?
It's right on line 44. He would have paid $5.3 million, which is 24% of his $152.7 million of positive income. And that's in large part because he was able to say he had negative income of $103 million.
Okay. So because there is an alternative minimum tax.
They disregarded most of the negative income.
Yeah.
He had to pay taxes, he had to pay more in taxes, but he still got a benefit. You know why? Because at the top, people are supposed to be paying 35% that year, 39.6% this year. But if you're in the alternative minimum tax, you only pay 28%.
Okay.
That's a 20% discount on your taxes. Would you like to get a 20% discount on your taxes? That's what Donald Trump got here.
So the issue that, I tried to lay out at the top of the show reasons why people are so interested in his tax returns. The White House has made this issue and saying it's only reporters who care. People don't care. This was litigated in the election when he didn't release his tax returns and people voted for him anyway. There are a number of reasons to be interested in his tax returns, and I think a number of reasons why people continue to be.
And most importantly, what we don't have here, which is this describes the types of income, but not the sources.
Okay, so
that's what we need to know. Who is the president getting money from?
Well, we need to know, A, sources of his income, whether or not he's beholden to somebody. We also need to know whether all the things he said about himself and his wealth and his charitableness and all those things are true. But we also need to know if he is going to take actions as president in terms of tax policy that are going to benefit him. And you're saying,
benefit his benefactors.
Yes.
Yes, I mean, it's a very complicated, tangled issue. I mean, here's a simple question to ask. Every other president's released their returns. We have Hillary Clinton's and Bill Clinton's returns back to the 1970s. Why is it that Donald Trump is so insistent that we're not to see his tax returns? There must be something hiding in his returns. You know, I've been at this for 50 years. I started as a teenager doing investigative reporting. And every time some high-level politician wants to hide something, it always turns out there's a reason. They've got something to hide. I have lots of things we can think of that Donald Trump has to hide, including sources of income and his connections to the Russian oligarchs, who are essentially, Rachel, a state-sponsored network of international criminals. And you got to think about it in that way and understand that's their position in the world. And Donald Trump really is desperate that we don't see where his money comes from. And this is a man who we know was very deeply involved with one of the biggest drug kingpins in America in the 1980s. He risked his casino license just to show his loyalty to that man. He did business with the biggest mobsters in New York. For years, he traveled with the son of the head of the reputed Russian mob boss, himself a twice convicted felon. He says, I wouldn't know if he was in the room, even though they were together all the time, traveling. And many other criminals he has associated with throughout his life. So it's particularly relevant for us to say, where'd you get the money?
David K. Johnston is the editor and founder of DCReport.org. He is the one who obtained this Donald Trump tax return 2005. David, can you stay with us for a moment?
Sure.
We're going to bring my colleague Chris Hayes into this discussion. And I want to get back to this issue about the sources of Trump's money and also the source of this document tonight. We have published this 2005 tax return from the president on maddowblog.com. We've also linked to David K. Johnston's extensive reporting on this on DCReport.org. David's back with us in a moment. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.
From the specter of terror here in Spain, isn't it? Only hours after that van plowed into the crowd in La Rambla, one of the most popular, if not the most popular avenue here in Barcelona, and very famous all across Europe as well. That's always packed with tourists and with residents going shopping on the stalls, heading down to the sea, because that Rambla goes from the center of the city down to the sea, and it will have been particularly packed today because it's August, because it's summer. And look at it now. Behind me is the Plaza de Catalunya, one of the main squares here. And usually at this time of the year, this place is bustling with tourists and residents. And look at it now. Not even on Christmas Day, you see Barcelona so empty, so eerie. This is what you feel here. It's an eerie sensation. And the fact that the driver of the van managed to run away, to get away, the fact that only hours after that attack, there is another terrorist attack in a town that is only 2 hours south of Barcelona. The fact that 2 people have been arrested in connection to the Barcelona attack. 4 people have been killed in this other terrorist attack, plus another one seriously injured, the police said, can only mean that there is a wider organization at play. We don't know yet, of course, whether these 2 terrorist attacks are related, but the fact that there are so many people involved suggests at least that there was some kind of organization behind it, and it's not, as in the case, for instance, of London, the lone wolf having just decided to run people over, and that was it. Rachel?
Let me just ask you one question about this second attack, Claudia. Thank you for that understanding in terms of what we're looking at behind you and how eerie it is in Barcelona. It's hard for me from this distance to get any kind of sense of what might have been the target of the second attack. If in Cambril that wasn't just a police action chasing down the perpetrators, but in fact that was a second attempted attack, one that either police just responded to or were able to interrupt. Do we have any detail or any understanding about what might have been the target for the second attack?
Well, I can't speculate on that yet because the police hasn't revealed any information on why were they there and why they carried out the attack there. But what I can tell you is that Cambrils is down south, about 2.5 hours drive. And then if you drive another 45 minutes south, that is another town, a town when on Wednesday night an explosion took place. And on Wednesday night, they thought that that was the cause of a gas leak. But as you mentioned in your intro at the top of your program, now they believe there could be a connection between that explosion and today's attack in Barcelona, and perhaps the one in Cambrils. It could have been a bomb-making factory where the explosion just went off and they had to rush these 2 attacks. And the fact that these 2 towns are not so far from each other, well, that could be an indication that all these 3 towns, so the town south of Cambrils, and Barcelona, could be related, Rachel.
NBC's Claudia Lavanga reporting tonight from Barcelona. Claudia, thank you for being up, especially given how late it is there. I really appreciate you joining us tonight. Thank you. Joining us now from Iraq, where she is reporting on ISIS, is Rukmini Callimachi. She's the New York Times foreign correspondent who focuses on ISIS and al-Qaeda. Rukmini, thank you for being here. I know it's also the dead of night there. I really appreciate you being with us.
My pleasure, Rachel. Nice to be with you.
So I was talking a few moments ago about basically what I have learned from you and your reporting at the New York Times about what to watch for in ISIS claims of responsibility. Before we got word of this second attack, possibly, or at least the second police action tonight, which appears to have left 4 people dead and another person seriously injured at the hands of police, we did get what appears to be a claim of responsibility from ISIS. Am I right that that's unusual? How do you view that?
It is unusual if we assume that the 2 people that are in custody now are the perpetrators of this attack. I don't know if they are the actual actors of the attack, but you are right. ISIS in general does not claim attacks when their assailants are still at large, specifically because, as we assume, they are not trying to create a case against them and make it easier for police to put them away.
In terms of what we know about the operation today, we don't yet, it's always hard in the immediate aftermath of these things to know what's connected. It's possible that that house that blew up south of Barcelona last night really was a gas leak, and it wasn't a bomb, and it wasn't connected to these things. It's possible that this action tonight was somehow a separate course from what we saw today with that van attack in Barcelona. But if it turns out that these things are connected, that there was an explosives component, that there was a vehicle-borne attack, that there were surviving attackers who then mounted a second attack after this spectacular event in Barcelona today. Does that tell you anything in terms of whether this is, inspired by ISIS rather than directed by ISIS, whether this is homegrown, whether this might have been directed from abroad?
Just starting with the very first attack, the van attack, we know that there were at least 2 people that came out of that car. So already we know that the lone wolf hypothesis is out of the question. There were at least 2 people that were directly involved in that attack. The police have been pretty forceful on their Twitter feed in saying that the gas attack, the attack that we believed was a gas attack from last night, and the Cambril attack appear to have some connection to this. This is their working theory right now. And if that theory proves to be correct, then we're talking about a multi-site terrorist attack. That takes planning, that takes a network, that takes resources, and that to me suggests something more than an inspired attack. This could be a true directed ISIS attack.
Rukmini, one last question for you. I mentioned in the introduction that Spain, of course, was home to the absolutely devastating Madrid train bombings in 2004. And we've also been told that Spain has been sort of a way station, a stopping off point for Western European fighters who are leaving home to go fight with ISIS in Iraq and Syria. That said, Spain has not been the target of a lot of the style attacks that we've seen in London, in Berlin, in Nice. Do you have any sense of how Spain is viewed as a particular target by ISIS in this current iteration of ISIS?
If this attack is indeed ISIS, it is the first ISIS attack in Spain, the very first one. So you are completely correct in portraying it that way. Spain is much lower down than France, than the UK, than the United States, than even Germany in ISIS's rhetoric. Those other countries have been repeatedly threatened by ISIS, and Spain has been threatened, but much less so. The very first terrorist attack that I covered on this beat when I joined the New York Times was the Charlie Hebdo attack in January of 2015 in Paris, and the Hypercacher attack at a supermarket a couple days later. The man who did the Hypercacher attack, Amedy Coulibaly, is considered the first ISIS-inspired, directed attacker in France. And before he did that attack, he traveled to Spain, specifically to Madrid, to drop off his girlfriend so that she could catch a flight to Istanbul and join the caliphate and essentially be spared imprisonment afterwards. So before this attack, like you said, I used to view Spain very much as a way station, not as a place that would necessarily host its own attack. But obviously, the events of the last hours have radically changed that.
Rukmini Callimachi, New York Times foreign correspondent, focusing on Iraq and ISIS, joining us tonight from Iraq. Rukmini, I really appreciate you taking the time and taking the effort to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel.
We have so much news developing tonight from around the world, from around the country, from inside the White House. Stay with us tonight. Lots to come. Tonight, the Vice President, Mike Pence, returns early from an overseas trip he's been on to South and Central America this week. We're still not sure why Vice President Pence gave up his Panama trip, dinner with the president and his trip to see the Panama Canal tomorrow in order to fly back early to Washington tonight. But the vice president's office has now said that he plans tomorrow to attend a high-level national security meeting on the subject of the war in Afghanistan. Now, why does the vice president need to be there for an Afghanistan meeting? Nobody knows. If the vice president does need to be there for the Afghanistan meeting, why couldn't he just call in for the meeting? Nobody knows. We do know that what has been circulating recently in terms of the administration's plans for Afghanistan is a very provocative proposal to try to turn the Afghan war into a private, for-profit enterprise instead of an effort run by the U.S. military. This is Betsy DeVos. She's the Trump administration's education secretary, although she barely made it into the cabinet. The fight over her nomination was close enough that Vice President Pence had to come in and break the tie on the vote for her nomination. Before becoming education secretary, Betsy DeVos had no experience in the public sector at all. But she does come from one of the richest conservative political donor families in the country, as does her brother, Eric Prince, who's the founder of the private military contracting firm Blackwater. Following Blackwater's disastrous tenure in the Iraq War, Blackwater doesn't exist anymore. And Eric Prince doesn't even live in the United States anymore. But in December, he resurfaced bizarrely in the middle of the Trump-Russia story. And that has given us something new to watch for in tonight's and tomorrow's news. And that story's next. Stay with us.
The Jaguar F-Paint.
In April of this year, thanks to some truly gonzo reporting in the Washington Post, we learned that Eric Prince, the former chief of Blackwater, the brother of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, we learned that Eric Prince, of all people, took a meeting with a representative of Russian President Vladimir Putin in the Seychelles Islands. It was a meeting organized by the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates. The idea was that the Crown Prince, for some reason, whatever reason, he wanted to facilitate contact between the Trump campaign and Vladimir Putin. And the way he did it was by bringing in Putin's emissary on the one hand and Eric Prince on the other. And he held this meeting in this remote island location so they could synchronize their watches or whatever during the presidential transition. Now, the meeting reportedly happened in December. It was reported in the Washington Post in April. Eric Prince has since acknowledged that the meeting did take place and the Washington Post was right. But he's downplayed the significance of the meeting. He's described the whole purpose of those discussions, the whole purpose of him being in the Seychelles Islands, as just business. Well, we have since learned that one business proposition Eric Prince has been selling is that the U.S. government should pay him $10 billion a year so that he can run the war in Afghanistan as a private for-profit enterprise instead of as a U.S. military action. Eric Prince has done a handful of interviews on this subject. He's very proud of the idea. He has cited colonial rule under the British Empire as the model for how he thinks his private army and private air force should conduct the next X years of the Afghanistan war. The idea of the education secretary's billionaire brother being installed as a self-styled viceroy in Afghanistan to be paid billions of dollars a year by the taxpayers to run his own private war there, it's enough to curl your eyelashes, right? It's hard to believe that would ever be taken seriously outside of Hollywood. I mean, the news reports about Eric Prince making this proposal, they've generally taken the tone that this idea is not really being seriously considered by the Trump administration. Honestly, that reporting has been offered in the same non-specific spirit in which we all keep getting reassured that there are real adults in charge somewhere behind the scenes in this administration and that, therefore, nothing too terrible will happen. Forgive my skepticism. James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, was recently asked about Eric Prince's big business plan to take over the war from the U.S. military. And although we keep hearing that Secretary Mattis is one of those adults who won't let anything too weird happen, he didn't exactly sound dismissive of the idea when he was asked about it.
Mr. Secretary, does the Afghanistan strategy at this point contain any provisions for a significant number of contracted security forces or private? There's been a public discussion about significant increases like 5,000, 5,500 contracted security forces, 90 fleet private air force.
The strategic decision have not been made. It's part of the options being considered. And the president's open to the advice of the Secretary of State and myself and the Director of CIA.
It's part of the options being considered, he says. What at this point is too crazy to imagine? That the president might threaten to rain fire and fury and power like the world has never seen on North Korea? That the president might endorse a rally by white supremacists and neo-Nazis and describe them as not bad people? Is it even more inconceivable than that stuff? That the president might say the war in Afghanistan will now be run by this guy Eric from here on out? The reason, at least the stated reason, that Vice President Mike Pence is having to come home early from his overseas trip tonight is because of a meeting that's just been called to discuss Afghanistan strategy tomorrow at Camp David. That meeting will involve the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, the President, and the Vice President. We shall see what comes out of that meeting. Mike Pence was also supposed to do a bunch of Republican Party events and fundraisers this weekend in Virginia. Those events have been canceled. So again, we will see what comes out of this Afghanistan meeting. I don't think it's unreasonable to brace for some truly bizarre news on that subject. But if something like that is going to happen, if something like that is going to get announced, it's worth considering that this is a particularly difficult, challenging, in some ways strange time for the U.S. military. Partly this is a difficult time for the U.S. military because we are at war. And the military bears the entire brunt of that while the civilian world pays very little attention to it here at home. Today we learned that an Army Green Beret was killed and 11 Utah National Guardsmen were wounded in eastern Afghanistan. The young man who died has been identified by his family as 27-year-old Green Beret Aaron Butler. He's from Monticello, Utah. He was a championship high school wrestler. He was the 7th of 8 kids in his family. He was one of 7 brothers. His family says he signed up for the Utah National Guard while he was still in high school, which means even if he signed up 10 years ago, doing the math, that means the United States was already many years into the Afghanistan war when Sergeant Butler enlisted to serve in the war that eventually took his life. So the news of his death, those other 11 Utah National Guardsmen all being hurt in the same incident, that is huge and very sad news in Utah tonight, in the National Guard, in the community of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. The U.S. Navy was also rocked tonight by the publication of the Navy's first investigative report into that bizarre crash between a U.S. Navy destroyer and a Japanese cargo vessel back in June just off the coast of Japan. This is a devastating report. It describes in detail and at length how the sailors on board that destroyer fought for their own lives and fought to save each other when those two ships collided in the middle of the night. The efforts to save each other included heroic efforts to save the captain of the ship. The report describes how 5 sailors used a sledgehammer and a kettlebell from the ship's gym to smash their way into the destroyed stateroom of the ship's captain. The ship's captain, his stateroom, basically took a direct hit in that crash with the cargo ship. The sailors who were trying to save him, they did get in. The ship's captain, according to the report, was hanging off the outside of the ship for his life by the time they smashed their way into him to save his life. And those sailors were able to save him, but he will now lose his career in the Navy. The commander of the ship is being relieved of command, as will the commander who was his second in command on board, as will the command master chief who was the senior enlisted sailor on board. 7 U.S. sailors died in that crash. Apparently, the Navy has not yet determined the overall question of why the crash happened and which of the 2 ships was at fault, but without waiting for that final conclusion, they say they already know enough to fire all the top leadership of that U.S. Navy destroyer. So that is very serious news in the Navy. They're taking very dramatic action. And it can't help in a stressful and high-stakes time like this that all the branches of the military are also this week facing a new unnecessary crisis that was created out of thin air by the U.S. president. A crisis in which all the chiefs of all the branches of the U.S. military have felt the need to break with their long-standing strict practice of avoiding politics. All of the service chiefs this week have felt compelled to put out public statements bluntly disagreeing with, bluntly departing from statements made by the president on race after the Charlottesville rioting this weekend. The Navy Chief of Operations was first to respond this past weekend, saying, quote, "Events in Charlottesville are unacceptable and mustn't be tolerated. U.S. Navy forever stands against intolerance and hatred." That was followed soon thereafter by the Commandant of the Marine Corps, saying there's no place for racial hatred or extremism in the U.S. Marine Corps. That was followed by the Chief of Staff of the Army, saying the Army does not tolerate racism, extremism, or hatred in our ranks. That was followed by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, who put out, admittedly, a slightly milder statement, saying, "I stand with my fellow service chiefs in saying we are all always stronger together." Less blunt, but I think we know what he means. That was followed by the Chief of the National Guard, who spoke more directly. He said, quote, "I stand with my fellow Joint Chiefs in condemning racism, extremism, and hatred. Our diversity is our strength." Service chiefs in the military don't usually do this, let alone the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. But tonight, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Joseph Dunford, said this to Voice of America.
I can absolutely and unambiguously tell you that there's no place for racism and bigotry in the U.S. military or in the United States as a whole.
Or in the United States as a whole. The service chief, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, they stay apolitical. They stay out of domestic politics strictly, both stylistically and literally as a rule, they stay out of it. Uniformed military personnel are not allowed to be involved in partisan politics, and the military brass lives that ethos every day. That said, even when the civilian leadership of the U.S. government is making nice with and being complimentary to white supremacists, the military feels a need to separate. The military has its own very acute history on the subject and its own operational reasons to make clear that they're not following this president down that particular political path. Here's just one example. You might remember in April 2014, there was a multiple murder in Kansas, a domestic terrorist attack that targeted a Jewish community center and a Jewish retirement home in Overland Park, Kansas. This nutty old man who committed those murders was a committed, lifelong white supremacist and neo-Nazi. He shouted Heil Hitler after he was arrested. He acted as his own lawyer at his trial. He gave the Nazi salute in the courtroom after he was convicted. He said his only regret about the murders was that none of the people he actually killed turned out to be Jewish, even though he picked those locations for his attack in the hopes that he'd be singling out Jews to murder. At his trial, he unsuccessfully tried to introduce video evidence from his past leadership of a uniformed group of white supremacists in North Carolina. Turns out he'd been a founding member of the White Patriots Party in North Carolina in the 80s. Before that, it had been called the Confederate Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Before that, it had been the Carolina Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. And they, in fact, wore military uniforms, and they marched in military formation. They did military-style training. They also freaked a lot of people out at the time by the fact that they seemed to have access to some military-grade weapons. One of the things that was most unsettling about those Klan groups and that White Patriots Party when it emerged, and they started doing all these marches and demonstrations in the 80s, is that their leader at the time, the guy who all those years later would end up shooting those people at a Jewish community center in Kansas, their leader back in the 80s when he was running the White Patriots Party in those Klan chapters, turns out he had built up his leadership skills, his organizational skills, his weapons training and military training, which he imbued to those Klan groups. He built it up while he served for 20 years in the United States Army. But the instructive thing to know about that now is that when the Army, even way back in the day, when the Army figured out what they were dealing with him, they kicked him out. He participated in the Greensboro Massacre in 1979, when Klan groups and Nazi groups ambushed a lefty march and rally in Greensboro, North Carolina. They murdered 5 people. He was in the National Socialist movement at the time. He was in the American, basically, Nazi party at the time and attended that ambush. And the Army thereafter kicked him out for distributing racist propaganda after they found that he had participated in that event. The U.S. Army, all the branches of the military, have long had a policy of kicking people out if they find them to be part of racist or extremist groups or involved in racist or extremist organizing. Under Ronald Reagan in 1986, Secretary of Defense Cap Weinberger issued a special directive re-upping that principle for all branches of the military. September 1986, he sent out a priority message reminding all services that all military personnel duty-bound to uphold the Constitution must reject participation in supremacist organizations. A few years later, in 1990, 5 Air Force MPs were thrown out of service for being Klan members. 1995, when they caught the guys who did the Oklahoma City bombing, it emerged that they had first met and made friends in the 1st Infantry Division at Fort Riley in Kansas. Partially in response to that, in 1996, the military re-upped and strengthened its anti-extremism regulations. Military personnel must reject participation in organizations that espouse supremacist causes. Quote, commanders have authority to employ the full range of administrative procedures, including separation or disciplinary action against military personnel who actively participate in such groups. Then in 2009, they re-upped it again. They clarified that you could be thrown out of the service for fundraising or demonstrating or rallying or recruiting or training or organizing or leading members of supremacist groups. You could be thrown out of the service for distributing racist materials. In 2012, they re-upped it again, making clear that you could be thrown out of the service, you could be prevented from joining the service. Not only if you actually do all of that active stuff to participate in racist groups, but even if you have a tattoo or a body marking that is associated with a racist or extremist group like that. The military literally now gives commanders an extremist tattoo decision support matrix. So you can get advice in figuring out whether that stupid winged dragon on your recruit's forearm is just a stupid winged dragon, or maybe it's a Nazi winged dragon. The U.S. military has as much of a white supremacist infection as the rest of American society. The difference between the U.S. military and the rest of us is that in the U.S. military, it's not just terrible to be a Nazi scumbag. In the U.S. military, it is illegal to be a Nazi scumbag. And they freaking police it. And it is crucial to U.S. military leadership. And it has been recognized for decades as crucial to military leadership that the military is absolutely crystal clear on this subject. And so when the president, the commander-in-chief, starts blurring that line, then yes, the service chiefs of the U.S. military feel the need to jump in immediately to try to make that line clear again, to try to erase any confusion that anybody might have on that subject. As if they didn't already have enough on